Hi everyone and welcome to Asama Rat Care. So today's video is going to be about selecting a dry mix. So this is kind of one of the components of the rat's overall diet. There are three main components that I would say make up a regular part of kind of any rat's diet. So you've got your dry mix, which is your staple in most cases. It'll cover the majority of the rat's nutritional needs. You've got your kind of fruit and veg side of things, which is used to kind of add in extra nutrients, or you may also choose to feed wet meals to do that as well. So they're kind of together, they're kind of the fresh food element of a diet, and then you get treats. And I'll try and do a video a little bit about each of them, but the kind of most basic and most fundamental part to get right is the dry mix, because for most people, and I will say some people choose to do things slightly differently, and as long as they kind of think through what they're doing, that's absolutely fine. But for most people, the dry mix will make up the majority of the rat's diet, and should as well, because it's kind of the staple. It's the kind of, it covers the majority of the nutritional needs. You don't often need to do a lot on top of that. So when we're talking about dry mix, there are kind of two main things to take into account. The first off is nutrition, and I will try and do a video that talks a bit more in detail about the different nutrients. If you actually watch my review on the Red Mills conditioning mix, I actually go into a lot of that detail, but I will do a kind of proper separate one at some point. But the nutrition, we want a dry mix to provide adequate nutrition for the rats that it's being fed on. It's fairly common sense. We want it to be balanced. We want them to kind of get all the macro and micronutrients they need from it. Some dry mixes need a little bit of topping up with that, and that's absolutely fine as long as you understand what needs topping up and then do so. And then the next bit that makes a dry mix the dry food the kind of choice is enrichment. And I don't know that that's quite the right word for what I'm after, though. Enrichment comes into basically everything I do, but the idea is that there's a lot more to food than eating the same kind of identical block of kind of nutrition every single day. Food offers us an opportunity to give a lot more to rats, so it gives us an opportunity to challenge them intellectually. They have to go and find the food. It gives us a chance to give them different tastes and different textures and different shapes even. It adds something to their life that, much like it does for us. I mean, the majority of people watching this video are probably very much like me and love food, and rats are no different. And if we can give them a kind of diet that meets the kind of intellectual needs, so kind of more than just providing the nutrition, that is kind of taking it. So I see it as kind of, you've got the basics, which is your nutrition, and then you've got the thing on top of it that makes that mean something more to the rats. And we're limited with the things that we can give to rats that really keep them entertained, keep them happy when we're not there to play with them. And let's face it, the majority of the time we're not there. You can give them great cage setups and everything, but unless you motivate them with something, they're probably going to sit around a lot of the time. Some of them they'll still choose to kind of play and do things, but if you can motivate them with decent food, a bit of excitement, then that's a kind of really important factor to food as well. And that really comes into when you're choosing your mix. So when I say mix, it's probably, I'm jumping ahead of myself almost on that one. So we've got a kind of dry food. We know that we're going to be feeding them every day. They're going to be getting a kind of a staple amount of that all the way through their lives. So we have to pick something that for me is more than just that nutrition. There are two main kind of options for feeding in terms of a dry mix. And like I said before, some people do choose to go outside of that box and they may feed in majority of fresh foods and so on, and that is fine, but it does take a lot more work. For the majority of owners, you're going to be looking at these two kind of main options for dry mixes, and I happen to have them here. So this is where I spill stuff all over the floor. By the way, I did try filming this video before with the rat's assistants. This is a really bad idea when it came to food, and they robbed most of it, so and it was just so distracting. I've had to stop and start again on this. So effectively, we have the kind of two most common styles of food here. On this side, we've got the pelleted diet, sometimes known as lab blocks, sometimes known as nuggets, etc. And on this side, we have a mix, which is very simply a mixture of grains, vegetables, kind of seeds, that kind of thing, a little bit of meat protein, or in my case it turns out we've got a little kind of cricket. You never know what you find in one of my mixes. But yes, so those are the kind of two main options. So when we're talking about basic nutrition, this is what a lot of your kind of nuggeted, pelleted foods sell based off. So they say in each of these blocks is the perfect amount of nutrition for a rat. Now, one thing that is quite interesting about this is if you actually read the back of the packets on all these different pellets or the nutritional details, you'll find they're all different, and yet they all claim to be the perfect amount of nutrition for a rat. That is because there isn't a perfect amount of nutrition for a rat. And like I say, I could go into that at detail, but I'm trying to resist that so this video doesn't become too long. But effectively, the nutritional requirements for a rat change through its life. It also changes depending on its environment that it lives in, kind of how hot or cold it is. It'll change depending on their activity levels, to some extent their sex, their health, etc. And it'll change subtly in a lot of those cases, but it will still change. There isn't a perfect amount of nutrition for any one rat. So ultimately the kind of idea behind a pelleted diet is a bit of a lie, really. You can't just feed this for an entire rat's life and have them live to their kind of full extent, perfectly healthy, etc. You're unlikely to do a lot of harm feeding them for kind of long periods, other than you'll probably find that your babies get a bit stunted, they tend to be out of condition. In fact, your adults won't look as amazing, but they're probably not going to get really ill and die off it. They're not going to get any extra kind of excitement out of it, they're not going to get that enrichment out of it, but it will kind of keep them ticking over at an okay-ish level. But for me, you need more than that for rats. You shouldn't just be feeding them for them to be okay-ish. You want to be feeding them for them to be kind of shiny, healthy, active, fit, kind of energetic little animals that are also really enjoying life. And that's where, for me, a good mix comes into it. So there are multiple ways to feed a good mix. Mine is a homemade mix. You've probably seen it if you've watched my complex mix video. You can make a simplified version of that simple mix video. There is multiple options for and information on kind of selecting a good mix on my website. So it talks about kind of buying commercial ones. I will say rat rations do some excellent mixes. You may need to add a bit of extra vitamins and minerals to that, but as long as you do that, then they're far superior than anything you'll buy from kind of normal shops around the place. There are many ways you can look at selecting the right kind of balanced mix, or selecting the right homemade recipe. I will say, if you're feeding a mix, you can't just stick any old crap into it. You need to actually think about it, follow a good mix recipe, and I will say there's a lot of recipes out there that aren't good. They typically feature a lot of kind of junky, heavily processed foods. In reality, rats need a diet that are mostly minimally processed. And the way we work that out is actually looking at wild rats. And when I say wild rats, I don't mean the rats that are stuck cleaning up after us, eating our rubbish, our litter, etc. I'm talking about the rats that our rats evolved from. So they lived on a diet mostly of kind of grains and cereals and not grasses, vegetables and herbs, and actually probably is a little bits of grasses as well, but also insects and carrion and little bits of meat. I mean, if they came across a baby mouse, it's fair game. So our rats have actually evolved to be kind of opportunistic, omnivorous scavengers. So they'll eat what they find. They eat meat and kind of vegetables and grains. They're not vegetarians. They're very much like us in that respect. And scavengers mean they will kind of hunt around and look for it. So when we're kind of thinking about the diet, and this is where it comes to kind of really pointing out why we're feeding the mix over the kind of pellets. This is so far, the kind of pelleted food is so far from a rat's kind of natural diet, what they've actually evolved to eat. When you're talking about animals, like let's say a rabbit or something like that, that eat a very kind of straightforward diet, They mostly one thing. In a rabbit's case, it's mostly grass with a few kind of extra vegetables, etc. in it. Their diet should reflect that. So if you're feeding a rabbit well, you're feeding it mostly hay, a few pellets, and a bit of vegetables on top of that. If you're talking about rats, you need to look about what they've evolved to eat. So they've eaten a mixture of grains, a mixture of bugs, a mixture of vegetables, etc. And you should try and make their diet meet that, because that will kind of meet a kind of deep instinctual need, not just tick off the nutritional kind of bare minimum. It will kind of meet more than that. But there are risks with feeding a mix. So one thing that you'll hear a lot of people that say, I feed pellets because I want to avoid selective eating. And selective eating is a thing. It basically is where a rat will pick out its favourite bits from a piece of food, or the bits it particularly wants to eat from a kind of an array of food. And that does happen. Sometimes it's good. There has been studies that show that rats will quite often select out the bits that they particularly need at that time. It's not flawless by any means. If there's lots of really high value stuff, and by high value stuff I mean things that they really like, that are really kind of calorific, fatty, etc., they will go for them, because it's a survival trait that they don't need in a cage but they need in the wild. But they will also go out and seek things like, I quite often offer mineral blocks in my cage, or mineral blocks, kind of pumice stone, cuttlefish bones, that kind of thing. And if they feel they need a bit of calcium, I find they will go and eat it. And actually it's interesting that my nursing mums are a lot more interested in that, and my kind of pregnant mums, or mums to be I should say, they will go out and seek that because their requirements are higher. And rats will do that to a degree, and that's kind of good selective feeding. But what you can also have is bad selective feeding, where they avoid a particular piece of food, or which does happen, or they only select the bits they really like. So if you've got if you're feeding them in a bowl, and you'll find suddenly there's a load of kind of boring grainy bits at the bottom, and they've eaten all the seeds and all the kibble and all the kind of nice tasty foods, and left all the stuff that they have to kind of peel out of the shell and eat the insides because it's hard work and fiddly. It's kind of like people really. We can get like that as well. Or they don't like the taste as much. I mean, it's one of those, and it is a risk with a mixed kind of food, but there are ways to offset that, and the kind of the instinctive intellectual enrichment type values far away that if you do it right, it's significantly kind of better. So how you do that is you need to limit how much you feed. So there are kind of internet myths around there that if your rat doesn't have food always available, it will die. This is nonsense. I assure you, my rats do not have that, and they're still very much alive. They claim I starve them, but they are quite well fed and in great condition. But no, there's actually research out on the internet that says that what we'd call starve periods, so that basically periods where the food isn't available, regular kind of short periods of that actually can extend rats' lifespans. So it's actually healthier for them to have periods with no food. Not only that, but when you're feeding a mix, if you limit the amount of food so that they do have these periods with no food, it'll stop the selective eating, because they'll be hungry and they'll go and find the bits that aren't that interesting, that might have fallen to the bottom, those tiny little millet seeds. Mine quite like millet seeds, to be honest, but they still have to hunt for them. But you'll find them digging quite a lot and getting kind of extra enrichment out of that, which is great. So by limiting the amount of food and trying to make sure there are periods in the day with no food, and actually what you can also do on top of your regular routine, so you can kind of, I feed mine twice a day, and then every probably about a week or two I'll miss one of the feeds, and that will not only make sure that they hoover up anything that they might have missed over the past week, it also gives them a slightly longer break for it, so a longer starve period, all trying to kind of help this. They will not, when I say starve is a bad word for it, even though it's the kind of proper phrase for it, they will not go super hungry in this stage. And to be fair, I wouldn't be doing it if I've got a cage with kind of a really old skinny rat in it, and I won't do it with kind of kittens who are kind of still living with their mum, or even kind of under 6-7 weeks old. But I will do it with the majority of my adults, and they're no worse for wear for it. And actually what normally happens is they kick most of the stuff out of the cage whilst they're digging through it, so they have an extra special kind of shuffling day, and then they get a nice big meal after that, and it's all good for them, and it helps them with their health and such. So kind of limiting the amount we feed and making sure the food is not available all the time is quite important. unless you've got a really skinny old rat, and obviously this kind of rules, you just pack food into them as much as you can, but majority of us are not in that situation. Or we can take that old skinny rat out and give it extra food like when we can, if we've got a group that needs more. So you want to feed a set amount per day. Now there are different ways to do this. A good way to start out, if you're trying to kind of get your head around about the right amount of food to feed, is start around about 15 grams per rat per day. And you can work that out, and I split into 2 daily feeds because that helps even things out a little bit. But some people feed once a day and that's absolutely fine as well. You just need to find what works for you and your group. So I'll feed first thing in the morning when I go in just before work, and then I'll feed last thing at night as well, which helps them go back in after free range marginally. Usually they still kind of mob me. And I personally choose to weigh my food out, so I know roughly the amount of weight for my main group. So at the moment there's 10 rats in there and I'm feeding them 85 grams twice a day. I'll let you work that out. It is more than 15 grams per day, but that's what my rats need at the moment. And I say that 15 grams is a starting point. Some rats will need more, some rats will need less. And you judge that basically off feed them that for a couple of weeks and see, are they getting fat, are they getting skinny, etc. And you can work it out, and it will change a little bit through their lives. So every time I go in and say hello to my rats, I'm giving them a quick feel over, a check, and when I notice them start getting a little bit fat, I'll drop the 85 grams down. If they get a little bit skinny, I'll give it a little bit more. And you have to kind of average over the whole group, but it works quite well. Some people find it far easier to just kind of get a known number of handfuls for the group, throw that in, and then they will add a little bit more or a little bit less as the kind of rats need that. That works absolutely fine too. Sometimes you do it in a scoop, and I've in the past I've had like marked up my scoop with roughly what felt about right for 2 rats, for 4 rats, and for 6 rats, and so on, and I could kind of judge it off that. It's kind of a see how you get on type thing and see what works for you, but it is a good idea to start around that 15 grams mark and then see how you get on with that. It gives you a baseline to work from. So you're limiting the amount you feed, you're making sure there's not food available all the time, and the other real key thing in terms of limiting selective feeding is scatter feeding. So I've done a whole video on this. It was one of my earlier videos, the 12 days of Christmas. I think it was the first day, which on scatter feeding. So I think that's literally filmed on Christmas Eve, so I'm wearing something ridiculous, but you bear with me on that. But that is all about kind of giving the rats a much more natural way of feeding them. And by scatter feeding I mean basically chuck it around the cage, and I'll chuck a bit on the floor, they'll get a handful in the digging box, they'll get a handful somewhere else around the cage, and they'll run around quite happily and find food. And that's to replicate the kind of natural instinctive way they would feed in the wild. Admittedly they wouldn't all have it crammed in a small cage and really easy to find, but they would have to search for their lunch, and that helps. Like, as they find something, they will then go and eat it. And yes, if they've got something really, really tasty like next to something not as tasty, they're going to eat the really, really tasty thing first. But actually, when you've got quite a lot of rats all hunting around, the tasty bits are well scattered around, everybody will get a little bit. And it may not be perfect in a single day, but over the course of a week, it pretty much evens out, and you find that it worked quite well. The only thing you do have to watch is if a rat takes a particular dislike to something that's tasty. So I had a rat once that decided she didn't like fish kibble because she was annoying. So she actually got a little bit deficient in protein, because that was one of my major sources of protein. So actually when I make my mix now, I had 2 different flavours of kibble, because that way, actually, if a rat doesn't like fish kibble, she's got chicken kibble instead that she can eat, and that works quite well. And you do have to keep a little eye out for that. If you're noticing a particular rat in a group that's struggling, it may be a case of kind of annoying selective eating. But in general, in the past, I'm trying to think how long I've fed a kind of proper mix, decent homemade mix now, but it must be kind of 15 years plus. I've had 1 incident, and it kind of works really well, and it suits the rats and they do well on it. And I know that I'm kind of catering to more than just the basics. I'm giving them enrichment as well as the nutrition. I'm kind of food plus, if that makes sense. So that's kind of where I'm coming from, and that's something that you can only feed with a mix. You can't do it with just plain nuggets. What I do see some people doing, and I'll mention really briefly, is they will feed let's say, a certain amount of nuggets a day, and then they will feed a grain mix on top of that, and then they might feed some extra kind of veg and fruit and a meal or something next to that. Now you do need to be careful when you're doing that, because these nuggets are a nice balanced diet. This mix is a nice balanced diet. If you're feeding these nuggets plus a random mix that you've put together that isn't balanced, and you're feeding a decent amount of it, then you're going to throw out the balance for that. Much like if you feed other stuff, a large amount of other stuff next to this that's also not as balanced, you'll throw it out of whack. So you do need to think a little bit around that, but generally speaking, just be kind of a little bit sensible around that. If you are going to feed this kind of stuff, feed them some enriched stuff, a decent balanced mix alongside that. Personally, I wouldn't want this to make up more than, let's say, 10% of my mix, whereas I actually do add it to my mix. In fact, if you have a quick look in there, you can see there's a couple of triangles, which is what I've picked out to give you that bowl. But it's quite nice to add a little bit to your mix. Some people feel like they should feed more of that diet, and that is an option. But just bear in mind that the thing that the rats will really get enrichment from and really get that kind of extra from will be the mix side of things. So I'd spend more time making the mix right than concentrating on finding the kind of perfect nugget. In terms of a really quick one, and it fits more in a review category really than this, but I want to mention it anyway. If you are determined to feed a nugget based food, I would personally avoid Burgess and Pets at Home nuggets. I've had bad experiences in the past with them, as have quite a few other kind of breeders. It's a UK based food, if you're watching here not from the UK. They're both the same thing, they're just in a different packet, and I've had a lot of mammary tumours pop up with that. It might be fine now, they claim the recipe's changed, but it's not something that I am comfortable with feeding. Science Selective, which is this triangular version, is fine. It goes back to this okay-ish. They're not going to get poorly on it particularly, they're just not going to really live enriched lives on it. But that's fine, available in the UK. And there's Oxbow in the US, which is actually slightly better than the Science Selective, but again, it's not kind of meeting their kind of extra needs on top of the nutritional requirements. But they're the kind of brands you're looking at. And in terms of mixes, make your own. If you're in the UK, Rat Rations do some excellent stuff. I haven't seen many mixes out there sold kind of more commercially from kind of shops that are actually any good. Reggie Rat is okay. It's better than okay-ish because it's a mix, but it's not amazing by any means. But it's better than feeding a really bland thing. But you can think around that. If you're interested in making a homemade mix, like I say, I've got a video that's on simple mix that you can make fairly easily. There's more information on the Red Mills review, and there's more information on the complex mix, and actually there's a whole section on mixing your own, well, different dry mix options on my website as well, but that does have some more kind of detail in there. And if you're interested in a condition point of view, I have done a video on coat condition, and there's a whole section on condition on my website. I will do a video on body condition at some point. In fact, I've got a few rats around at the moment I could probably use, so I might do that soon. But anyway, I've waffled long enough. This isn't as short as I would like, but I apparently can't talk concisely on diet because I find it very exciting and interesting, and I waffle too much. But hopefully this is useful for you. Any questions, just let me know. And bye for now.